Hi everyone, is everyone's video and audio all connecting and that sort of thing? What I might ask, unless you're directly speaking, if you could turn off your camera, that would be awesome. It just keeps things running smoothly. But welcome this evening. I'm going to pass to Nick Swar, who is the chair of the steering committee for GoldNet Research, who will commence tonight's Journal Club.
Thanks, Sally, and welcome everybody. Fantastic to have such interest in the Journal Club. And as people who've been before know, we try to keep it to an hour, fairly short and sharp, because we're very conscious that people have a lot of other things in their lives, and we want to not take up too much time, but also get to it, have a good discussion. We've got. I'm going to present a brief case study tonight about a smoker, and that sort of set the scene. And then Loe Albuquerque is going to help us with looking at the Cochrane review, which was updated recently about nicotine e-cigarettes. We've got the wrong title there for the what we're going to look at tonight in terms of the article, so ignore that. We are talking about nicotine vaping. And then we're going to hear from Melis Selamoglu from Monash University, who's done some work on GP views on nicotine vaping products. And we're going to be helped in the discussion by Associate Professor Kristen Shahood from University of Adelaide, who is a researcher in this area and works with the Thoracic Society of Australia and New Zealand, as well as her academic role at University of Adelaide. And we hope we'll have plenty of time for discussion and comments and chat and thoughts about this rather controversial topic. So next slide, thanks, Ali. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the Compumeri people, who the traditional owners, custodians of the land which Bond University now stands, and we pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'm conscious that some of you will be on other Aboriginal lands or Torres Strait Islander lands around the country, and pay respects to elders in those locations as well. So we'll move on to the next slide and the case study. Thanks, Ali. So what we're talking about tonight is really about the role of nicotine vaping products in helping people to stop smoking. We're not talking it so much, though I'm sure it will come up, about the uptake of nicotine vaping in younger people who might never have smoked. Now, that's a whole discussion which is very topical and very relevant. But tonight I'm going to kind of focus on what role, if any, do nicotine vaping products have in helping people to stop smoking. So the case is a 45-year-old man, he's married, no kids, and he came to see me with mental health problems, basically mainly depressive feelings, loss of enjoyment, low mood, and in a difficult social and financial situation, and with quite difficult marital problems as well. And his K10 score, for those who are familiar with that, was quite high at 37. So he had quite a lot of distress. It's a measure of mental health distress over the last 4 weeks. And he had a sort of reasonably long history of smoking. He started when he was in his late teens or early 20s, I think. And he'd smoked on and off ever since, which is not uncommon. And he'd had periods where he'd stopped for months at a time, sometimes, but had always returned to smoking. And when I saw him, he was smoking about between 10 and 15 cigarettes a day, and he's having his first cigarette within half an hour of waking. And for those of you that know the Fagerstrom test for nicotine dependence, that's an indication that he's likely to be nicotine dependent and therefore would likely get withdrawal effects if he tried to stop. He tried various ways of trying to quit in the past, using pharmacotherapies over the counter. He hadn't had prescribed pharmacotherapies, but he had used nicotine patch, nicotine gum. He'd not used Varenicline, but he'd always gone back. And it was usually emotional distress which had been the trigger for him going back to smoking. He'd also fairly recently started drinking every day as well, as I guess another manifestation of his distress he'd been in. You can see the past history. So not an unusual patient, perhaps in general practice, a combination of mental health issues and tobacco use and some alcohol use as well. So that sets the scene, and maybe now we go to Loay, who's going to take us through the Cochrane review.
Thanks, Nick. So thanks, everyone. So we will discuss the Cochrane review, just sharing my slides. So can you see the slide now, this share?
Yep, all good, Laura.
So,
Yep.
So we have choose this article, the Cochrane review, updated one, recently updated Cochrane review about the electronic cigarette for smoking cessation. And I understand if you haven't read that in full, because it's more than 300 pages, which is always a kind of a downside for a Cochrane review. And so we'll try together to going through that article and critically appraise it. So the element that we will discuss, what the key question of that article and whether that's relevant to the case that Nick presented, what's the result, whether that's result valid, trustworthy evidence or not, and whether what's the results, kind of try to analyze the result, interpret the result of the main result of this review, and then the applicability of the patient. And that will be mainly discussed in the next session of this journal club. So first, what's the main question, the key question that have been addressed? And this is a good kind of structure or framework to formulate the clinical question, which is the PICO or the PICO, what the population, the intervention, the comparator or the control group, and what the outcome that have been evaluated. And it's good in this review that you can answer this question from the abstract, or even looking at the title. It's clearly talking about the outcome, smoking cessation, and discussing the intervention, electronic cigarettes. And here in the abstract, you can see that it's for the population is people smoker, which is relevant to the case that Nick presented. But going also to the article, without looking at most of this answer for those questions, you can see it from the method section. So if we go to the method section in the Cochrane review, you will find more details about the population and the intervention, comparator, and the outcome that have been evaluated. So the population clearly about smoker who's currently smoke cigarettes at the enrollment of those trials, regardless of their motivation. The intervention, the most important to have electronic cigarettes, whether that's nicotine vaping or non-nicotine electronic cigarettes or vaping, compared to other intervention or no intervention. And the outcome, the most important one, smoking cessation, but they have also included some of the adverse, if there's any adverse events or serious adverse event. So that's about the outcome. So are you all happy with that? That's kind of a relevant study to go through and discuss. Yep, good. So we'll move to the question whether their study valid, trustworthy or not. And this is kind of a helpful structure or question that we can try to answer and address to find whether that's trustworthy evidence or not. First, whether the study or the author tried to find all the relevant available evidence to address that question, whether they have appraised or assessed the risk of bias of included studies, whether they included the right type of studies to address that question, and then the totality of the evidence and the heterogeneity. And let's discuss one by one. So the first question about finding, so it's important because it's a systematic review, it's important that the author and the review try to find all the relevant available evidence that can answer that question. And the main criteria to answer that question, if they have searched a few major databases like Medline, Cochrane, MPACE, if they have designed that search strategy to include both mesh terms and text words, and if they haven't limited only to English language, so there's no language limitation, and also if they have searched the reference list of included trials. including clinicaltrial.gov. So what anyone would like to have a go about whether this review have did some or all of those kind of elements of finding relevant studies? So have they searched multiple databases or one database, midline, PubMed?
I think they searched a lot, all of the relevant databases. I can't recall whether they looked in other languages other than English. That's a good question.
Yep.
But they certainly looked at all the relevant databases.
Yeah. So that's the positive. That's kind of, they balanced the 300 page or more for the Cochrane, that usually they have very good, thorough search strategy. So they looked at the midline, MPACE, SecInfo, clinicaltrial.gov, that's the registry database. That kind of minimized the publication bias. So even they looked at the non-published, or even if it's not published, they looked at those registry. And they have that's a mix between the MISH term, which is kind of a tag, and the free text word. And they have a publication date limitation to 2004, but they have a reasonable justification that before that date, there's no electronic cigarette, which is for me kind of reasonable justification. And they have also searched the reference list of eligible studies. I haven't found if they have any kind of search for other than English, but for my understanding from the Cochrane, usually they have no limitation about the language, and they haven't mentioned any limitation. So I would say that's kind of a comprehensive search to look at the available evidence. And for people interested in the search strategy, they have listed all the search strategy for all the databases that they have used, and that's clearly include kind of, or for me, all the synonyms for using that can be used for the electronic cigarette, for example, including the MISH term. So including vaping, electronic nicotine, electronic cigarette. Yeah. So to me, it's kind of comprehensive.
And Louay, just briefly to note, they also searched abstracts from the Society of Research Nicotine and Tobacco Conference, which is, I think, a little unusual for systematic reviews to look at abstracts from meetings, but that's another part of what they did. Yep.
So they have been to the grey literature. So by going to the annual meeting, the conferences, and also to the contacting, I think they have, contacting author of known trials. So they also contacting the author of known trials or those who publish in that field. So I think they did a good job for searching published and as well as grey literature to find relevant available evidence. So are we all happy that they did a reasonable effort to find all the relevant available evidence in this space to answer that question? All good? So the next is the A, whether they have appraised the included studies. So here they have included, and we will come to that in next session, next point. They have included both randomized trial and non-randomized trial, and they have kind of justification for doing that. So now the question whether they have critically appraised or assessed the risk of bias of included studies. And it seems that they have done that. And there is a section about the assessment of the risk of bias assessment. And they did that through the Cochrane risk of bias tool. And that includes the domain that's kind of the standard of practice for systematic review, includes the randomization, allocation, concealment, blinding. And they have also kind of detailed the process and some of the specific consideration in the field, especially for those kind of studies. So for example, for all those non-randomized trial, they assess the random sequence generation and allocation concealment as high risk, which is kind of expected because there's no randomization. And for blinding for randomized trial, they have depend on the comparator. If the comparator is an active control of the same intensity, even if there's no blinding, they judge that as low risk of bias. But if it's a minimal intervention, they judge that as a high risk of bias. And what they mentioned that this is the standard for concurrent tobacco addiction group. So what does that mean? My understanding for that, if they for example, comparing nicotine vaping compared to non-nicotine vaping or nicotine replacement therapy, because it's difficult to blind people to use vaping, they assess that as a low risk of bias in terms of blinding. But if it's kind of behavioral or no active comparator, they assess that as a high risk of bias. But the good thing that they have detailed that in a clear, transparent way. And similar to that detection bias or blinding of outcome assessment, they mentioned that, especially for smoking cessation, that they have to be assessed or verified biochemically to be low risk of bias. Otherwise, it will be assessed as a high risk of bias. And also for the attrition, they have kind of threshold as a 50% loss to follow up, or to be 50% or less to be as a low risk of bias. Otherwise, it will be high risk of bias. So they use the standard kind of tool for risk of bias, the Cochrane risk of bias, but also they use some kind of specific consideration that's well known for the Cochrane tobacco addiction. And that can be discussed later if that's kind of justifiable or not. All happy with the appraisal? Yep. And they have also presented all those kind of results in a summary, and also for each study, you can find that detailed. So for the inclusion, whether they included the right type of studies, as I have mentioned before, they have included both randomized trial and non-randomized and even uncontrolled intervention studies, which is, we expect for intervention study to include randomized trial as it's the highest level of evidence for primary studies, the best study design as a primary study for intervention or treatment question. But they mentioned that there is not a lot of randomized trial in this area. So that's why the justification for the uncontrolled inclusion of the uncontrolled intervention studies. So that can be discussed later if that's kind of reasonable justification or not. But the good news that in the totality and in the synthesis of the evidence, they have synthesized only the RCT alone. So they haven't mixed up those randomized and non-randomized trial. So any comment for the inclusion? Do you think that this is reasonable to call that they included both randomized and non-randomized studies?
Oh, I think it's reasonable. What's surprising is how few randomized trials there are, given such a contentious area, and how it's taken such a long time to get RCTs, given that, these are things you can do RCTs on. They're not a very complex RCT really, but there's still not a lot of RCTs despite the interest in the area.
Yep. And the last two elements, so I combine them together. So the totality of the evidence, if they have appropriately synthesized the result, and the heterogeneity, assessing the heterogeneity and whether they explain that. So the idea of this one is not to mix or total combine the result that shouldn't be combined together, mixed apple and oranges. And also if there's high heterogeneity, if that they try to explain the differences between the studies or not. So again, they follow the Cochrane rule, which is this kind of the standard of practice for doing systematic reviews. So they measure the clinical and methodological heterogeneity or diversity between the studies. And that's kind of the most common reason for heterogeneity. Could be clinical or methodological. And they measured that using the I-square statistic. And they have their threshold. If it's 50% or more, that's kind of substantial heterogeneity. And if it's beyond the 75%, they haven't tried to pull the studies together. So they thought that, or decided that this is too heterogeneous that can't be combined together. And in terms of the synthesis, they produced summary finding tables, force plot, so meta-analyze them together as if it's appropriate to do that. And also they did some kind of subgroup analysis to try to find the causes of heterogeneity if it's high. And they presented all that, and we'll come to that. So force plots, and also they have a long list of the characteristic of studies for each study. That's why I make it 300 pages. For each study, they have a list of all those PICO elements with the population included in the study, intervention, the outcome, and all the details about the risk of bias assessment. So the question, can we trust this review? And move to the next part about the analysis of the results.
No, I guess a brief comment. I mean, it's following standard Cochrane methods and the Cochrane Tobacco Group have been doing this for a long time. The criticism that's been in the media or well, in the literature or commentary is that some of the authors of the review are also authors on some of the papers. And I'd be interested in comments whether that matters and whether that is, I think in the tobacco world, that's not uncommon because there's quite a lot of people who are in both roles, reviewers and investigators.
That's really interesting. Yep. Yep. I understand that from memory that some of the Cochrane rule that if you are prominent kind of trial author, you couldn't lead a review that's including your RCT. But yeah, that's an interesting point for discussion. Yeah, and how that could affect the result.
See, Paul's made a comment in the chat.
Yep. So it's fine to include them as they are not doing the risk of bias assessment and selection of the studies. Yep.
And not doing that work, right? So you're not allowed to select your own study without someone else being involved. That's fair enough.
So the results. So they have 78 studies. That's a mix between randomized and non-randomized trials, 17 included in this update. And that's include more than 20,000 participants from 34 of them, almost half of them in the US and the rest 16 from the UK. So it's a mix across the country, but more than about half of them in the US, and all of them adults who smoke, currently smoking. And it's also, I found it interesting that 22, there's no motivation to quit smoking at all. 39 motivated to quit smoking and the criteria for inclusion. And the rest, there's no kind of specification about the motivation to quit smoking. And there is also some kind of study have enrolled specific population group. I thought the most important outcome that we'll discuss today about the smoking cessation, any adverse events. So the kind of one benefit and harms, about the benefit and harms. I haven't detailed a lot about the biochemical marker, but we can look at that if we would like to dig in one of those biochemical marker. And it's good to find that kind of the funding of those studies. So one thing that's 40 study were RCTs, and the 47 out of the 65 study that reported the funding have no funding from the electronic cigarette industry, which is good to note. But also that's mean that there are about 18 that have received funding from the tobacco industry. So for smoking cessation, so I will move. So I did that kind of a decision aid, so kind of easier to kind of analyze the results. I'll just stop share that one and share the other screen.
Just while we're doing that, Loay, we probably should say the electronic cigarette industry is not necessarily the tobacco industry, though in Europe, many e-cigarettes are made by tobacco companies, but that's not always the case. So e-cigarette industry and the tobacco industry are not the same thing.
I see. Yep. So they mentioned only electronic cigarette industry. So maybe we need to look if the tobacco industry have funded some of those trials. Yep.
Yeah, yes, well, yeah, good point, but it's unlikely that there would be. But as I said, some e-cigarettes are made by tobacco companies now.
Yep. So I thought that they have a lot of comparison group, but I thought the most interesting based on the case scenario that nicotine e-cigarette versus nicotine replacement therapy, or nicotine e-cigarette versus non-nicotine e-cigarette, or nicotine e-cigarette versus behavior support or no support. So, and the three outcome, we have smoking cessation and the adverse events. So if we look at that outcome for, if we have 1,000 people, that's for nicotine e-cigarette versus nicotine replacement therapy. If we have 1,000 people who have, just trying, it's large enough now. So if we have 1,000 people who try stop smoking, quit smoking, with nicotine replacement therapy, there will be 60 out of those 1,000 people who quit smoking as 6 months to a year. With nicotine e-cigarettes, 98 out of 1,000 people will quit smoking at 6 months to a year. That means there are 38 more people that quit smoking with the e-cigarette. That's for smoking cessation. And that's high quality evidence. That means all that kind of issue related to the risk of bias of included studies regarding the heterogeneity, imprecision, directness of the evidence, all of that taken into account. So that's mean any new evidence are unlikely to change that evidence.
No way, we should pause there for a second, because that's the most controversial finding of this Cochrane review, that they came to that conclusion that was high certainty, where I think all previous reviews had said it was low certainty. And if you look at that comparison of nicotine e-cigarettes versus nicotine replacement therapy, it's the Hayek study from 2019 that has the biggest effect, because it's the largest study. And they rated the quality of that study as high. They did the risk of bias. They thought there was a low risk of bias. You can see their Hayek 2019. And you can see that study has quite a lot of participants. So you can see, you can probably eyeball how big a weight it's got, 41% roughly of the weight. Other groups that have reviewed that study have not rated it as highly on the risk of bias tool, and that is causing some discussion around that, which we might want to spend a bit more time on in our panel session.
Yep. So that could be something to do with this special consideration that they have. That could be one reason why there's kind of discrepancies between their risk of bias assessment and other people risk of bias assessment, other group. But I agree with you, that's kind of, that's have low risk of bias assessment, and there's nothing they have in downgrade that, just all high risk, all low risk bias assessment. For the adverse events, they have 5 more adverse events out of 1,000 people out of 1,000 people, nicotine replacement therapy, there is 268 have adverse events compared to 273 with the nicotine e-cigarettes. So 5 more, but that's not statistically significant results. And similar to that, the serious adverse events, also there are 7 more out of 1,000 people using nicotine cigarettes compared to NRT, but that's low certainty evidence. So that's for the nicotine e-cigarette versus NRT. So I'm not sure if, Nick, would you like us to go through the other 2 comparison, or we can stop here? Because in their case, it's mentioned that I think the patient used nicotine patch. So I think that could be the most relevant comparison.
I think clinically it's the most relevant comparison. Are nicotine e-cigarettes better, worse, or the same as currently available therapies? I mean, we have approved pharmacotherapies in the form of nicotine replacement, in the form of varenicline and bupropion. So I guess the question that a clinician is facing is someone going to do better, or at least as well, if they're prescribed nicotine e-cigarettes as other therapies? And, you know, when you compare it to placebo, that's probably a less clinically relevant question. And interestingly, the quality of the evidence isn't as good in that second comparison. And in most instances, people would get behavioural support anyway. If you're giving someone some sort of pharmacotherapy, you should be providing behavioural support as well. So the comparison to no behavioural support is perhaps not a terribly interesting one from a, the clinician perspective. So I think we might, rather than go through those others, we might move on. That's fantastic. Thanks, Soy.
Thanks.
So Alex, should we move now to Melissa's presentation? Is that where we're up to?
Yes, absolutely.
Great.
And it's good to acknowledge that the presentation and the project that Melis is about to present, GoldNet, assisted with helping with recruitment of participants. So hence we invited her to come and give us kind of close the loop on the research that she's conducted.
Thank you. Thanks, Ali. Thanks, Nick. Okay, so I'm hoping everyone can hear me well and see my screen, but thank you for having me here today. I'm a final year PhD student from the Department of General Practice, and today I'll be presenting one of my research on the qualitative study on the perceptions of Australian GPs on e-cigarettes as smoking cessation aid. So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So currently this paper is under review by BMC Primary Care, and the preprint for it is available online, and throughout my presentation I will have a QR code there for you to scan if you wish to have a read of the preprint. So what are e-cigarettes? They are battery-powered devices that heat liquids to produce an aerosol which is inhaled by the consumer and is more commonly known as vaping. E-cigarettes are increasingly being marketed to both young people and older smokers as a safer, cheaper and less risky option to smoking, and have been promoted as smoking cessation aids. Although these products do not contain tobacco, they do contain nicotine, propylene glycol, glycerine, flavoring agents and other toxic chemicals that have shown to be harmful to health. So in regards to GPs, they have an important role in providing patients who smoke with information, support and treatment to encourage them to quit smoking. Although smokers and GPs around the world are exploring the use of e-cigarettes as a smoking cessation aid, in countries like the UK, they are heavily being endorsed, and in other countries like the US, their use is being discouraged. Despite Australia being the first nation to introduce a policy to prescribe nicotine e-liquids to patients, these are still very complex and confusing for GPs. Currently, the sale and supply of nicotine-containing e-cigarettes in Australia is illegal, and they are not TGA approved. However, GPs have the authority to provide nicotine e-liquids to their patients. So we use a qualitative descriptive study design to explore and understand the perceptions of Australian GPs. One-on-one semi-structured interviews were conducted online via Zoom between May and June of last year and ranged in length between 25 to 60 minutes. Participants were drawn from a survey study that we had conducted with Australian GPs between December 21 and March 2022. And from these, 33 GPs provided their email addresses and indicated a willingness to participate in the interviews. So from these GPs, we purposefully sampled participants from different states, gender, and years of practice, and participants were given a gift voucher for their time. The interviews included discussion, the interview topic, included the discussion of the role of e-cigarettes in clinical practice. We wanted to know about their beliefs, knowledge, and attitudes about the use of e-cigarettes in regards to smoking cessation. Also, the prescription of e-cigarettes to quit smoking and the confidence and confident levels of GPs in giving advice to patients about e-cigarettes in smoking cessation. Interviews were audio recorded and transcribed verbatim, and we use NVivo to aid coding, thematic analysis, and retrieval of quotes. So in total, we interviewed 13 GPs of equal distribution amongst males and females. 4 participated from Victoria and Queensland. We had 3 from New South Wales and 1 each from South Australia and Western Australia. And also most of our participants practiced in metropolitan areas, and the average years of practice was 19. So in total, we had 5 main themes. The first one being GPs' attitudes for recommending e-cigarettes, and there were diverse views among GPs towards recommending e-cigarettes and prescribing nicotine e-liquids. These mixed views arose from gaps in the participants' knowledge, as well as concerns held about the availability and reliability on the safety and efficacy of e-cigarettes. So one participant said that as a last resort to my older patients who are desperate to quit and have failed using all other methods is when they would recommend an e-cigarette. And another said that there is no situation where I would recommend an e-cigarette. I'm not going to recommend them to anyone. The second theme looked at the safety of e-cigarettes, and many GPs expressed optimism about the role that e-cigarettes could potentially have. Some GPs believe that e-cigarettes were much safer and less harmful than regular cigarettes, with one saying that I think they are a good tool, providing we accept there are unknowns, but I think it is a good tool to get people to stop smoking. However, others expressed concerns about the potential harmful effects e-cigarettes could have on the body and not knowing the long-term health effects they may produce in the future. So again, another participant said that concerns about harms and not knowing if e-cigarettes actually do help people stop smoking to be worth recommending them to use. The third one looked at the concerns of dual use and e-cigarettes being a gateway effect to other tobacco products, and there was much apprehension about this amongst our GPs that were interviewed. One said that it has the potential to become a window or a door to other tobacco products in a pathway to smoking, and another said that I think it is being used to appeal to adolescents and younger markets who aren't smokers. It's like cigarettes, it's an image thing. Understanding of current policy about e-cigarettes in Australia was limited amongst participants. Some GPs stated they knew very little, or their understanding of it wasn't very good, or they didn't know the specific ins and outs and had very little idea of the current legislation. Some had partial understanding, with one saying that my understanding is that the products are not TGA approved, but there was a desire to regulate the industry, and so prescriptions are required to legally purchase them or legally import them. A small number of GPs also expressed their concerns and frustrations on being gatekeepers to e-cigarettes. They wish they didn't have to do this. They didn't see why this needs to be a GP's problem, and that doctors really don't have a role here. Further discussions also took place about illegal risks, with a GP stating that I think the ownership of me prescribing e-cigarettes and taking on that risk is a negative. Why would anyone want to risk legally their career and potential legal ramifications 15 years from now? Once again, GPs had various comfort and confidence levels on prescribing e-cigarettes and discussing these with their patients. Some felt fairly to moderately confident, whilst others were not confident to answer patient questions. Some GPs mentioned they would be willing to prescribe e-cigarettes if they had more knowledge about them, with one GP saying that further information would always be helpful, for sure, just to increase the confidence around the prescribing. In regards to level of comfort to prescribe nicotine e-liquid, some GPs didn't feel comfortable to do so as they haven't had suitable patients, and others didn't feel comfortable due to lack of knowledge and the need for further information. And in order for GPs to feel comfortable to recommend e-cigarettes to patients, they suggested having further training and information available to them, with one saying that the availability of some sort of TGA listed standard would be nice. For example, that there's this many milligrams per 24 hours, there's a product, there's a brand name, it's on the shelf in your pharmacy and it's clear, it feels normal and normally regulated and somewhat routine, then I would feel much more comfortable being involved in this process. So this is the first qualitative study of Australian GPs' attitudes, knowledge and prescribing intentions on e-cigarettes for smoking cessation. The GPs were interviewed had diverse views about e-cigarettes, concerns around the safety and efficacy and limited understanding of current policy guidelines with strong influences on prescribing intentions. GPs voiced concerns about the possibility of e-cigarettes being a gateway to smoking and other tobacco products, especially amongst young adults, and the potential for dual use, and limited confidence to have discussions and answer patient questions about e-cigarettes arose from insufficient knowledge and concerns about the scientific evidence on e-cigarettes. So the information from this study will be useful to guide policy on e-cigarettes and contribute to guideline development that informs the potential role and place of e-cigarettes as smoking cessation aids. However, further research is still needed among GPs to clearly understand their perceptions and prescribing intentions, and there is a need for a clearer policy or guideline framework for prescription of e-cigarettes to inform and educate GPs about e-cigarettes as smoking cessation aids. So thank you very much for listening and for your time and attention. And I just also really want to thank GoldNet for assisting me with my data collection with GPs. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mills. That's just really, really helpful and I think actually very accurate from the discussions I've had in an anecdotal way with GPs and being chair of the College of GPs expert advisory group that tries to write a guideline to help. It is complex, it's difficult to understand, and there's a lot of uncertainties. So we're up to the part to kind of open it up for discussion, and I might bring Kristen in here from her perspective as someone who works a lot in the area. What are your kind of thoughts in this? It is a complex and contested space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also a Cochrane author and have worked with the Tobacco Addiction Group for over a decade now. So I'm very familiar with their standards. And it's interesting because risk of bias in particular, I can do risk of bias assessments with editors, including people who are actually authors of that particular Cochrane review. And we get different assessments, even individually, each time we do it. So it is still very much a grey zone. So especially with the Hajek paper being low risk of bias, I mean, it is still interesting to identify that and how that differs across some of the other studies who have assessed that same paper. So it's by no means a very clear-cut quantifiable assessment of the rigor of the trial studies being included. But at the end of the day, this main evidence for the recommendation is coming from just 6 studies, where obviously Hajek's 40% of the weight there. And Cochrane reviews are fantastic at looking at how these types of medications work in a very controlled setting, but not in the real world practice. And I think that's the real big difference here is we have a consumer product, and how this is going to actually work within the real world is very different to what we're going to be seeing in these Cochrane reviews, especially when Cochrane reviews and RCTs typically overestimate the real world effects here because there's a Hawthorne effect. This is where people are being observed and they know they're being observed, so they're going to perform differently than they would in the real world. But another thing with that particular Cochrane review, there's one study that compares e-cigarettes to varenicline, and that's not actually mentioned in the abstract. It's downplayed a little bit because what they actually found was a 3-fold increase in the odds of quitting with varenicline compared to e-cigarettes in this one, granted small study. But that's really left out of the dialogue. And we know from indirect comparisons with some of the other big studies, you've got varenicline and bupropion are much more effective than you would get with NRT or e-cigarettes, which are a similar kind of rate of effectiveness. Bupropion is more effective, varenicline is more effective. You combine them together, you get higher rates of effectiveness in quitting success. But when we're looking at this big dialogue now, there's so much misinformation and public cry out about what's going on. So I think that's really muddying the waters of what policy decisions are now being made in this space.
Thanks, Kristen. That's very helpful. Just by way of background, the College of GPs got JBI, Joanna Briggs Institute, to do a review some years ago, and there was even a smaller number of studies then than the 6 there are now. I think there are only 3, and that included the Hayek study, and the risk of bias was not rated. Was rated, I think, differently, as you were saying, Kristen, to the way it's been rated by the Cochrane Group. And we're actually getting Herico, who's another systematic review group, to have another look and to do the same group of studies that are in the Cochrane review to do their process and do a risk of bias assessment. Because one of the challenges as someone who chairs that group is, what are we going to do? Are we going to change our evidence rating, which is currently that the evidence is low, low certainty, and are we going to reconsider our recommendation relating to that particular comparison of nicotine e-cigarettes versus NRT? And I take your point that there's really a lack of evidence of e-cigarettes versus other pharmacotherapies. Also, the interesting question about if you combined e-cigarettes with other pharmacotherapies such as varenicline, would you get an even bigger effect? And that's another question that hasn't been answered yet. But I might open up to the group. And I guess following up a little bit from Melissa's thing, the whole uncertainty aspect for GPs. These are not approved products through the TGA. We don't know about their long-term health effects. And that was reflected in some of those comments that Neil's presented in a qualitative study. It does make it difficult, but we also have a person in front of us who would like to help to stop smoking, and often those people have tried other methods without success. So be able to open up the group for comments and questions and thoughts about both the science and the practicality. And we might come back to the patient before we close to talk about what I decided to do with that patient. Comments from the group, either in the chat or verbally. Has anyone else but me actually prescribed these in practice, had the experience?
I don't, Nick, sorry. And I'm sorry I came so late, but I did review a paper not long ago on the use of vaping, and there was very few of the studies that actually went long term. They really, they were 12 weeks, 14 weeks, 20 something weeks, but I don't think I'm just curious how many, and I'm sorry I missed your presentation. I was on another meeting. But I just, a few years ago, I was really put off by all these studies about teenagers and primary school kids vaping and how, the risk of smoking in the long run, and that sort of really put me off vaping big time. But I do get that I was once a smoker myself, so I know what it's like, and I do get all that stuff about the physical sucking and playing with the
yeah, so they're good points, Jane. I think just in terms of the Cochrane review, they only included with 6 months or more follow-up, but you're absolutely right. There's quite a few very short-term studies, which were a lot from Italy for some reason. One particular author, Caponetto, a number of studies just for 12 weeks, 6 weeks, that sort of thing. But the review that Loay went through, it's 6 months or more.
Oh, good. That's good. I'm just sorry. And
with biochemical verification of that people.
Well, that's really good. I know there's papers that said that it's good stuff. It's just like, it's that sort of leakage and how much of it will go to other people, and
Yeah, well, the leakage is
Really?
really interesting. I mean, when you look at the uptake of nicotine vaping in young people in recent years, it's been alarming.
Yes.
And that colours the whole discussion because, you know, there's a recent thing that Cancer Council Victoria have done. Melanie Wakefield is very well known academic from Cancer Council Victoria, and this was done in 5 capital cities around the country, and looking at people's reports of having vaped in the last 6 months. And the most recent data, which is January to March 2023, so very recent data, is that in the 18 to 24 age group, 19.8% of those surveyed said they'd vaped in the last 6 months.
Yeah.
And in the 14 to 17 age group, it was 17.4%. And if you only had looked back about 3 or 4 years, and those rates were 2 to 4% back in 2019. So over that 4-year or roughly 4 and a bit year period, it's gone from about 3% or so, 2 to 3% to those figures I've mentioned, which is just an extraordinary rise. Most of those people have never smoked.
Yes.
And so, but it's that purchase and use is overwhelmingly of illegal vaping products. They're not getting them from doctors. They're getting them from the vaping store, from the supermarket, some service station, convenience stores, via friends. They're not getting them from doctors. I think there's, you know, as a college, we tried to work out, you know, is there leakage, you know, diversion of vaping products from GPs? And we've found absolutely no evidence of leakage from GPs so far. Now, I'm not saying it's not happening, but there's really no evidence. But, you know, the uptake in non-smokers is really very significant. And there is evidence, and particularly Emily Banks has published on this, that some of those people will take up combustible tobacco.
Yes.
And
there's a lot of publications. There were a whole flood of publications in JAMA or New England Journal a few years back. It was before COVID. It was really scary what had been going on over there.
Yeah. Interesting a comment from Kristen in the chat too, that one of the problems is that things that are labelled don't have nicotine on the label, can have nicotine in them. And when, you know, University of Wollongong's been doing this work, when things are either bought or seized from places that sell them, 90% of the products, even if they're not labelled as having nicotine, do have nicotine. Yeah. So just seeing this comment from Anita. Question for those who recommend prescribe, what kind of adverse effect are you discussing, if anything, e.g. EVALI? So EVALI, for those who aren't aware, is vaping-related lung injury. And there was an outbreak of that in the US several years ago with some thousands of cases and a number of deaths. And it's a pneumonitis that related to, seems to be closely related to vaping cannabinoids, and the cannabinoids that have a vitamin E acetate in them that makes the cannabinoid vaporize more easily. There have been reports that can happen when you don't have cannabinoids or vitamin E present. And about 1 in 12, I think, of the people in that US study said they hadn't had cannabinoids in their vaping liquid. But that is still somewhat contentious about whether it can happen in the absence of vitamin E acetate and cannabinoids. It probably can, is my view. And Kristen's just noticed the youngest death from EVALI was in a 14-year-old boy. So, you know, this is an issue. And you've probably heard of popcorn lung as well, which is a form of lung inflammation that seems to be related to a particular ingredient that can be in vaping liquid. That vaping liquid that ingredient's not meant to be there. It's related to one of the flavorings, which produces a buttery flavor. But that's another phenomenon that's been associated with vaping. Yeah. So it's challenging. Other comments from the group?
So Nick, can I ask? So it's a challenging situation between how to balance between that kind of public health issue, not wanting that, especially the younger adolescents, to take on vaping or cigarette smoking, and the individual about quitting smoking, how to balance that from clinically as well as guideline decision.
Yeah, and it's also a regulatory thing too, because the recent changes announced by Minister Butler in May were about trying to stop access to illegal vaping products by young people. And that the proposals include banning all import of all vaping products, whether labelled nicotine or not, unless they're coming through the medical access framework. So that will allow Border Force to seize any vaping product that isn't coming through the medical, to a Australian pharmacy. Because currently there's thousands of vaping, mostly disposables, coming into the country every day. And so that is what the regulatory change is about. There's also other things, including the labelling and something about restricting flavours, perhaps restricting the concentration of nicotine that is in a vaping product. And if we've got a moment, we'll talk about that. Because some people are concerned about that, particularly with the US experience of Juul, which is like, has quite a high nicotine concentration, and that's been, used a lot in a recreational sense in the US. Yeah, I just see Kristen said something about the National Party announced in March they want to ease regulation, unsurprisingly when they accept at least 275,000 in donations from okay, all right, well, yes, it's a politically contested world as well, and that makes it challenging. Shall we just go back to the patient for a moment to kind of round things off, if that's okay? Ali, whether you can bring up the patient again, or if not, don't worry. So what did I decide to do with this this gentleman? I did prescribe him nicotine vaping products. I gave him a fairly high strength one, prescribed him one that's got 59 milligrams per mil. So it's the same strength as Juul. So some people would say that's a high strength one, which it is. But my basis for doing that is he's clearly nicotine dependent because he's smoking in the first half of hour of waking, and he's having a reasonable number of cigarettes per day. So I think he needs a substantial dose of nicotine to replace what he's getting from tobacco. And I saw him recently, just last week. And I saw him just last week, and he has stopped smoking only fairly recently. And he made a couple of interesting comments about his experience with vaping. He said how different it was from tobacco in the sense that there's a risk you can do it all the time. You don't have to kind of go outside and, or necessarily, spend whatever amount of time it takes to smoke a cigarette. You could have a puff of a vape here or there or anywhere. And he's kind of conscious of that risk. But he said he found it very effective in controlling cravings for nicotine, and that he thought it was something that he would need to use for a reasonable length of time for the process of becoming a non-smoker, because he talked about how you have to re-identify someone who doesn't smoke, who doesn't think about cigarettes, who doesn't think about them when they have a emotional upset and all of those overlearned behaviours that take you back to tobacco if you've been a smoker, and the risk of re-addiction, which happens so quickly if you stop smoking, stop nicotine use, but then relapse and have a small amount. So we'll see how it goes. And we did talk about the lack of evidence on long-term safety. He's had no short-term adverse effects at all. His risk is he likes it too much. That's what he's worried about, and that he'll need to navigate that and how he will actually come off vaping, which is a whole other discussion, perhaps for another night, because some of those young people we talked about who've taken up vaping will probably need help in stopping. So I'm conscious we're up to time, just over time. Any final comments before we thank our speakers and thank everyone for coming along? Noah, anything you wanted to add, or Kristen, or Melis?
I was just going to say, I think there's certainly potential for e-cigarettes to be used as a quit smoking aid, but we just need to be conscious of all the other side effects and everything else that's going on around this. So it definitely has its place, but right now it's gone a little bit off the rails because it's been driven by a multi-billion-dollar industry for the large part.
Yeah. Okay. Melis, anything else you'd like to add?
No, not necessarily. I think just maybe more information around the use of e-cigs and how to help GPs in their prescribing if they do want to prescribe it. I don't think there's enough knowledge around that. And again, Nick, as you discussed, how many, like the level of nicotine they need to prescribe for their patients as well. Just things around like that. There's just uncertainty, and I think that's why probably GPs do not want to go down this way or down this pathway to help their patients quit.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of anxiety. There's only about 2,500 authorised prescribers in the country out of what, so 30,000, how many thousand GPs? So it hasn't had a lot of uptake of the authorised prescriber pathway, though the minister's talking about removing that as part of the changes. So that'll be interesting. So thanks everyone for coming along. It's been a really good session. Thanks, Loay, as always, for taking us through with such a panache through the study, a complex study. Kristen, for your insights, and Melis for your very interesting paper, and we're glad to help support that. I hope and it's great to see it's getting published soon. So thoughts for the next journal club, always welcome. Just send them to Ali via the email, and please look at the projects that are on our website in case you want to get involved. Ali, any last words for you?
Nothing specific from me, but a big thank you to those who have joined us. Obviously, those who presented, Melis and Kristen, thank you so much for your insights. Super exciting stuff. And obviously, Melis, when your paper is published, please share, and we can circulate as well for our members too.
Thanks, everyone.